Hello and welcome. In this video, we will show you how to design a Dolby Atmos mix room using our Dolby Atmos Studio technical guidelines and our Dolby Atmos room design tool, or called DART. I'm David Ziegler, working for Dolby as a content and partner relations manager, and happy to show you how to get up and running with a Dolby Atmos Studio. So the first thing you should do is download these documents I just mentioned. So you just open a browser and you go to professionalsupport.dolby.com. So quite simple, yeah, professionalsupport.dolby.com, and you will find everything you need in there. So then you click on Dolby Atmos Music and Post, because that's of course what we are doing here. So you can see it's the same website for music studios and for post-production rooms, because basically the technical requirements are the same. So, and in here you go to Room Design and Calibration. By the way, at another point, I would also recommend that you check out all the other resources here, because there are a lot of very interesting articles and tutorials. So it's a fantastic resource. But today we jump straight to the chapter Room Design and Calibration. And there you find the Dolby Atmos Home Entertainment Studio Technical Guidelines. I just opened that in a new tab. And you find the Home Entertainment Dolby Atmos Room Design Tool, so the DART. Let's also open that one. Okay, let's first have a look at the technical guidelines. So this is really the document that you need to follow when you're designing a Dolby Atmos room or studio. And that's also basically our agenda for today. So we will go through that chapter by chapter, and I explain to you what to do in each of these chapters. First, you will see that actually we have two of those documents. So this is the main document, how to design a Dolby Atmos mix room. For 95% of all the studios, this is all you need. There are a few cases when you build a very big room using 16 or more loudspeakers, then you should have a look at this extended document, which is much longer and really includes all the corner cases. But in the majority of times, this is all you need. So this is the document we're working with today. How to design a Dolby Atmos mix room. Let's find out. Okay, so this document is designed that you can read it chapter by chapter, follow the steps in each chapter, and you should end up with a reasonably well-designed Dolby Atmos studio. The whole document is 10 pages, so you can see it's not rocket science, let's put it this way. It's doable. So let's dive into it. So in total, we have 7 chapters. 7 steps that you need to take to design the room. The first chapter, you need to define the room dimensions. So you need to actually figure out how big is the space that you have available, and ask yourself quickly if the space is actually big enough to do Dolby Atmos. So that will be the first one. Second chapter, then you define your mix position. So you ask yourself, where is actually my sweet spot? Where am I sitting when I'm mixing or listening to Dolby Atmos? That's critical to define, because all the speakers in Dolby Atmos are placed in relation to the mix position. So you have to define that as the first step before doing anything else. So once the mix position is defined, you go and position a certain number of speakers, typically 7 or 9 speakers around you. So at the same height as your ears. That's why we call them ear level speakers. And then you position a certain amount of speakers at your ceiling. This is what we call overhead speakers. And then, of course, you need 1 or more subwoofers. Of course, for the bass response in the room. And then, of course, you have to define what speaker models you're going to work with. So the main question here is, will the speakers of your choice have enough headroom for your room size? So the DART helps you calculate that, and we will show you how. And then basically all of this is about speakers, But of course, you also need other things besides speakers. You need an audio interface, and you might to consider things like speaker management, room EQ, these kind of things. So we will briefly touch upon that in chapter 7. And once you have done all of that, your room should be ready. Of course, it's possible to ask for assistance. We have a network of Dolby certified service partners. You will find a Dolby certified service partner in every territory. These are people that are trained by Dolby and that can help you if you want. It's not mandatory, but you can reach out to our service partners at any point for questions about room design and room calibration. And you can, of course, also email Dolby through our studio onboarding form. So happy to help at any point. Now let's go to the first chapter, define the room dimension. So that's of course very simple. You just take a laser meter or a tape measure and you measure the distance from your front wall to your rear wall. That's your working space length. Then you measure the distance from the side, from the left side to the right side, and that's your working space width. And then you measure the distance from the floor to the ceiling, and that's your working space height. And of course, there are cases where the room is not a perfect rectangular shape. In that case, you might have to make an approximation. So as you can see in this drawing, the front wall is a little bit shorter than the rear wall. And in that case, we just say make an assumption and try to get it as close as possible to a square. So as I said, it's not rocket science ultimately. Try to make an approximation as good as possible. There are also cases where we might have like a little nook back here, a little corner, maybe with a couch or something. And if this is not covered by speakers, you can probably just ignore it. Okay. And then once you have defined the space, you should ask yourself, is my room actually big enough to do Dolby Atmos? This is a question we get very often. So in order to answer that question, we have here guidelines. So again, these are not hard and fast rules, but based on our experience, this is what typically works well. So if you look at the space between your speakers, so basically how much space is in the end left once the speakers are placed, if you measure the distance between the left surround and the right surround, you can see that here, is that distance in the end should be at least 3 meters. Because otherwise, let's imagine you're sitting here in the middle of your speakers. These two speakers are less than 3 meters away. That means from your left ear to the left side surround, that would be less than 1.5 meters. So it becomes very narrow. So we typically say try to make sure that you have at least 3 meters of distance. And the same goes for the distance from the front to the rear. So we recommend to have at least 3.5 meters distance measured from the front speaker, the center speaker baffle, to the back surround line. So as you have probably noticed, this is slightly less than the working space dimensions that we talked about just a minute ago. So when you look at these minimum distance, we are really looking at the distances between speakers, because you might have a room where you have in-wall speakers. So in that case, the distance between speakers is the same as your room dimensions. But you might also have quite a big speaker that stands in front of the wall. So in that case, you have to subtract the size of your speaker from your room dimensions. Yeah, so let's imagine the room is 4 meters wide, but this speaker is 30 centimeters and this speaker is also 30 centimeters. So that means the distance between the speakers would then only be for example, 3 meters and 40. So again, it's not rocket science, just make an easy calculation to see if you're in the right ballpark. And if your room is very small, then you might have to reconsider. The same goes for the height. If you measure from the floor to the baffle of the overhead speaker, that should ideally be 2 meters and 40. I saw a lot of studios where it's slightly less, maybe just 2 meters and 30 or something. That's still okay. This is a technical recommendation, right? So, but you should try to aim for something like that. And again, we're measuring from the floor to the baffle of the speaker. So let's imagine your room is 2.70 meters high, but then you also have, you can see here, you need some space for the actual mount and for the bigness of the actual speaker. So if you really measure from the floor to the baffle of the speaker, that's of course less than the height from the floor to the ceiling, okay? Again, if you have in-ceiling speakers, it's identical, but in most of the cases, it will look more like this, okay? All right, let's have a quick look at that, and then you can already get an understanding if your room is big enough to do Dolby Atmos. At this point, we are done with chapter number 1, and now we should open DARDT and do the same thing that we just did in the DARDT. So we open the Home Entertainment Dolby Atmos Room Design tool. So first you need to download it. Click here and download it. And then you go and open the file. And that's how it looks like. In the beginning, it's a Microsoft Excel-based file. So it's a tool that we have programmed in Microsoft Excel. And it uses a lot of macros. You can already see here that it is giving you a warning to activate or to allow macros. So let's do that. And all of these macros also mean that you can only run it in Microsoft Excel. It will not run in things like OpenOffice or Mac OS numbers. So it has to be Excel because all these macros only work in Excel. Okay, so we have opened the file. We have agreed to allow the macros. Now we have to agree down here to our terms and conditions. And then you come to this page. You have to choose if you want to work on the default mode or if you want to go to the advanced mode. The default mode covers 95%, and there are a few things that happen in the advanced mode. We will get to that in the end, but for now we can stay in the default mode. All right, so once we've done this, you will see that basically we are now at the same point where we have been in the document. So basically chapter 1, DART is asking for your working space dimensions. So let's enter. Let's say the length of the space is 5 meters. It's 4 meters wide. And let's say from floor to ceiling, that's 2.70 meters. So now we have entered our working space dimensions into DART. You can see here. Now let's jump back to the document and go to chapter 2. Define the mix position. So again, that's very easy in the beginning. Just look where you are seated. Where is your mixing desk? Where is your table? Where is your sweet spot? Take a tape measure and measure how far away it is from the front wall. So that's your mix position. But there is a little catch. In Dolby Atmos, we want the mix position to be on average in the middle of all the speakers. Okay, so in Dolby Atmos, sound can come from the front, from the side, from the rear, and from the top. That means all directions in Dolby Atmos are equal. So if you would sit, for example, very far to the front, let's imagine you would be sitting up here where we have the word from center here in the document. Let's imagine you would be here. Then you would be very close to left, center, right, and very far away from your back surrounds. So even if you would compensate for the delay and for the level difference, they would still sound quite different, because if you sit very close to one speaker and very far away from another, they will always sound slightly different. So then it's very hard to get a balanced sound field. And that's why we recommend that you should be between 30% and 70% of the distance from the center to the back surround line. Again, it sounds a bit technical, but if you think about it, the distance from the center to the back surrounds, and then you should be between 30% of that and 70% of that. 30%, that's mostly for example for music mixers that are sitting quite upfront to the console and that probably are used to have left and right on the meter bridge. So you are used to have a short distance to the front. In such cases, aiming for a 30% mix position will give you a good, like it won't feel too different. And the 70% on the other end of the spectrum, that is typically for people that are mixing in more of a cinema style setup, maybe with a big perforated screen and a projector. These are also rooms where Dolby Atmos content is being mixed. And in such cases, you typically will be further away from the front. So that's why we allow this big range. Okay. In some cases, it might happen that your existing mix position is so far to the front that you have to consider to change your mix position a little bit for Dolby Atmos. So basically make sure that you are between these 30 and 70%. Otherwise, it will be very hard to make a balanced sound field. Okay, so let's go to DART. Let's assume we are at, let's say, 2 meters away from the front wall. So that's slightly to the front. You see the room is 5 meters long. And let's say our mix position is at 2 meters. And then we say enter. And now DART will open and it will allow us to position the other speakers. So let's jump to the next chapter. Position the ear level speakers. So the ear level speakers are left, center, right, and your surrounds. In most Dolby Atmos studios, you have at least 4 surrounds. That's one pair here that's called side surrounds, and one pair that is called rear surrounds at the back of the wall of the room. And in some cases, you have an additional pair of speakers that is this one here that is called wide surrounds. So if you have wides, then that are 9 speakers. So for example, a 914 setup means that you have wides. And if you don't have wides, then that would just be 7 speakers around you. So that's 714. That's the most typical Atmos setup, because the wides are, of course, an additional expense, and some studios start with 714. So as a rule of thumb, I would say wide speakers are very nice because they increase the resolution, the panning resolution. But it depends on budget and space. You can also work without wides and still get a good result. There are a few studios that actually even reduce it further and only have one pair of surrounds. So that would then be 5.1.4. And we typically only recommend that for pre-mixing and smaller spaces. But for a critical Atmos mix room, we would always go for at least 714. All right. So here you can see in the document the recommended angles. So very simple. So you should put your side surrounds at 100 degrees and your back surrounds at 135 degrees. And left and right are, of course, at 30 degrees, which is the same that they are also in a perfect stereo setup. So no changes for left and right. And of course, the center is right in front of you in the middle. And for the wides, we say they should be 20 degrees outside of left and right. So that means 30 plus 20, that would be 50 degrees. And in case that you cannot place the speakers at this perfect position, we have a range, an angular range. You can also put them to 90 or up to 110. Same goes for the back surrounds. You can put them to 120 to 160. So we have an angular tolerance for every speaker. And one little catch, if you would imagine that you really max out the position of the side surrounds and put it at 110, and then you also max out the position of the back surrounds and you put it at 120, that would then just be 10 degrees away from each other. Okay. This is of course not good. That's why we have one additional rule which says the distance, the angular difference between two speakers should always be at least 30 degrees. So for example, if you would put your side surrounds at 110, in that case, your back surrounds should be at least at 140. So very simple. Let's jump back to DART. And this is where we have to dive a little bit deeper into that tool. Because here you see, here we have these three dimensions, X, Y, and Z. The X dimension is the distance measured from the center line. So we always assume the center line to be in the middle of your room. So like an imaginary line that you draw from your center speaker. And because the left and the right side of your room, it should always be symmetric. So for example, if your left side surround is at 100 degree, then the right side surround should also be at 100 degree, just to the other side. And that's why it actually makes sense to make the position dependent on the center line. So for example, in this case, DART is telling you left side, right side are 1.70 meters away from the center line. You can see that little yellow line here that is showing you what exactly we are measuring at this point. So that means if you, for example, reduce this value, it means you bring the speakers closer. You pull them away from the wall and bring them closer inwards. And the Y distance is the distance from your front wall, from the front of your working space. So for example, in this case, the left side surround are 2.30 meters away from your front wall. So you remember a moment ago, we defined our mix position in this hypothetical studio to be 2 meters away from the front wall, right? And you remember the side surrounds are at 2.30 meters, so they are basically here 30 centimeters behind you. So basically next to you, slightly behind. This would be the current position. And then you can at any point click here and change that. And for example, you could say, no, I want my speakers to be at 2.10 meters. And then DART will automatically change the angle and calculate it. And for example, if you would put your speakers at a position that is outside of our recommendations, like let's say put it all the way to the front, then this field will get red. And on the right side here, no, on the bottom here, you have a little checkbox. If you click that and you move your mouse over the cell, it will tell you what's the problem. It will tell you left surround, right surround angle recommended to be more than 90%. Then you know, oh yeah, it's 53. So then you change this. Go back to, let's say, 2 meters, and then the field is gray again. Okay, so that's very handy little tool in case you made something outside of our recommendations, the tool will let you know. And one more thing that is very handy, on the right side, the tool will always make a little drawing of your space. So here you can see the tool automatically assumes left, center, right to be at the front wall, side surrounds to be here, you see, next to you, rear surrounds to be at the rear wall. And now, of course, you can, for example, change your back surrounds and say, I pull my back surround slightly forward. I don't want to have them all the way at the back. You can just click here and say, instead of being at 4.70 meters, that's all the way at the rear, I move it, let's say, to 4 meters. So I pull it forward. And you see what happens? If you scroll to the right, the drawing has now adapted. And now you can see that the speakers are no longer at the back wall, but pulled a little bit forward, which is something that's possible. You see, now it's more close to an actual circle around you. Both options are fine. If you go all the way to the back wall, it will maximize your listening area. You can also pull it a little bit forward depending on what you need. For example, in many cases, people have a door back here, so you need to enter your room at some point. So that's why it can make sense to change the position of your back surrounds to make sure that you can still open the door. Okay, so between this drawing and the DART, you can very easily play around and find out where to put your surround and front speakers. Maybe one important thing to mention, this is referring to the position of the speaker baffle, to the front of the speaker, okay? That's why by default, this is already at 0.3, okay? You see here, 30 centimeters. So the tool is automatically assuming that the speaker is at least 30 centimeters big. And if you put the speaker right in front of your wall, that means the baffle of the speaker is still 30 centimeters away from the wall. So the tool is automatically assuming that. And you can even, if you really look closely at the drawing, you see that it's actually also shown like that. You have your wall, and then you have the baffle of the speaker to be away from the wall. Okay. And if you would have an in-wall speaker, then very simple. In that case, the baffle of the speaker is at the same distance as the actual wall. So in that case, you would change this to be 0. So now it would be an in-wall speaker. And you can see that the DARDT has automatically adapted, and now it shows the speakers to be in the wall. And you can do, of course, the same with your side surrounds, for example, by just saying, no, they are not at 170 from the center line, they are 2 meters away from the center line, then you would make them into in-wall speakers. If you would remove them even further outside of your working space, then you would get an error message. Yeah, speakers cannot be placed outside the working space. Yeah, sure. Okay, so this basically gives you all the steps to position your surrounds. Now we jump to the next chapter and we talk about the overhead speakers. So when you look at a Dolby Atmos studio from the top, it will always look something like that. You have your left, center, right, and your surrounds. We just spoke about that. And then you will have typically 4 overhead speakers. As I said, in some studios you might have 6, but the majority of studios have these 4. And they should be placed symmetric on top of the mixing position, so that it's basically a perfect square and the mix position is right in the middle of that square. So that means the only question left is, how big should that square be? Should it be more like this, or should it be more like this? So should it be a wide square or a very narrow, tiny square? And the answer is, it depends. So it depends mostly on the height of your room. So if your room is quite high, then typically you will end up with something that looks like this, where you have a wide square. And if the room is has a very low ceiling, I sometimes had these kind of studios. If you have like a small producer studio in the basement and the ceiling is just not very high, in that cases, typically the overhead speakers will end up being very close to each other, so it will look more like this. Now, why is the height depending or influencing the size of this square? So that's a very simple reason. What we really care about is the angle measured from your head to the speaker. So be careful, that's not the angling of the speaker itself. Yes, that's also important. Once you have mounted your speaker, you should tilt it so that it shoots in the direction of your head. But what we mean here is more the angle that you draw when you make a line from your head to the speaker. You see that shown here in blue? And this angle should be ideally 45 degrees. Okay, so for example, the center is at the same height at your ear, so that's 0 degrees. Okay, and something that would be right on top of your head, that would be 90 degrees. It's something that you could call like a voice of God loudspeaker, which we don't have in Atmos. So in Atmos, we want the middle way. We want to be at 45 degrees, halfway up, basically. Okay, so you should place your speakers to get this magic 45-degree angle. That's the perfect angle. Again, we allow a bit of tolerance. You can also go up to 55 degrees, but 45 is usually the best. And we want that 45-degree angle both in the, now we're looking from the side. So this is like a side view of your room, but the same angle also applies if you would take that whole thing and turn it, and now you will look from the rear. You see, this is a drawing from the rear. So here is you, and this is your chair. And here you have left, center, right. Here you have your screen. Here you have your surrounds. Okay, so we're looking from the rear into the studio now. And again, we want to get that 45-degree angle. So looking from both sides, we want that 45 degrees, and that's why in the end, the speakers will be a square. And that's also why the height of the room influences the distance between the speakers, okay? Because let's imagine our room would be very low ceiling. Let's imagine the ceiling would already be here, okay? In that case, you would follow the same 45 degrees, but your speaker would already be here. So that means ultimately the speaker is closer to you. And the same happens at the other side. Okay, so that means in a low ceiling, following the 45-degree angle, the speaker will be closer to each other than in a high room. It's a little bit, okay, it's a little bit of 3D math. So that's at the same time the most complicated part of designing a Dolby Atmos studio is really the placement of the overheads. But I think with this drawing, you should hopefully get an idea what we want. And of course, also the DARDT is happy to help you. So let's look at the DARDT. And if you scroll to the right, you will see these same pictures. It should look very familiar. Again, we have the front, we have the side, we have the rear, looking from the side here. And here you see the overhead speakers. So DARDT is giving you a visual representation of the speaker positions. And if you scroll to the right, to the left, sorry, it will give you the angles. So it will show you the 45-degree vertical angle, and it will show you the 45-degree vertical angle seen from the rear. So you see we have 2 times 45 degrees. So DARDT will automatically position your speakers to hit that perfect 45 degrees. So you could technically simply take the X, Y, and Z values and find that correct position in the room and drill your hole for the speaker. So, for example, the front overhead should be, in that case, 80 centimeters away from the front wall, and the rear overhead should be 3 meters and 20 away from the front wall. And same goes for the left-right, so 1 meters and 20 from the center line for left and right. The same goes for left and right. And this is, for example, assuming now that your height is at 2 meters and 40. So you see, you remember, we said our room is 2 meters and 70. Okay. And now we have to mount the speaker on a mount, and the speaker itself is also has a certain dimension. That means when we measure to the baffle, to the front of the speaker, I think 2 meters and 40 is a fair assumption that you're basically losing 30 centimeters between the height of the room and the actual space where the speaker baffle will be in the end. And in case, for example, you have an in-wall speaker, in that case, you would change an in-ceiling speaker, you would change that and you would say, no, I have an in-ceiling speaker, so my baffle is actually at 2 meters 70. It's at the same height as the ceiling. So let's do that. And you can see immediately, because the speaker, you basically just moved the speaker 30 centimeters higher. And by doing that, you changed the angle. So now actually the angle changed so much that it's now outside of our recommendations. You see it immediately got red. So in that case, what you do is you move the speakers further away from each other. You You move them higher, so then you move them further away, which decreases the angle. So it's a little bit of playing around with the tool. So let's assume we just pull the speaker back a bit. And then the angle reduces and it's no longer red. And then to stay symmetric, we also pull the other one a bit forward. So now we have the identical angles, and you can see that DART is automatically adjusting. You see now you have in-ceiling speakers, and you see that the distance between the speakers is now bigger. So it's quite handy. Jumping between this section and this section always gives you the visual feedback so that you have an understanding of what you're doing at any given point. And if you ever forget what value you are entering, you can just use the mouse over and it will give you this little drawing what you should enter at any point. And if you're ever unsure, you jump back to our document and have another read of the chapter. Okay. There's actually a little rule of thumb. If you start working and you probably haven't filled out the DART completely, there is a little rule that actually helps. And we have put that into the document. That's the only time when you're doing this document where you actually have to probably take out a calculator and do a little bit of mathematics. So we say, if you take the distance from your ear height to the baffle of the overhead speakers, if you take this distance here and you multiply that by 2, then you get the distance between your overhead speakers. The reason why this exists is because basically this and this forms a triangle. And in a triangle, when these two are the same, then the inner angle of the triangle is 45 degrees. So that's quite handy. And this actually helps you to make a little ballpark assumption. So for example, if you are in a room and you know your seated ear height is at 1.20 meters. So when you're sitting and then you measure how high is your ear, that's 1.20 meters. So that's what we call ear height. And then let's assume your overhead speaker baffle will be at 2.50 meters. So that means from ear height to that is 1.30 meters. Then you can very quickly assume the perfect distance between your overhead speakers will be 2 times 130, that's 260. So that already gives you a ballpark. You will know, okay, the distance from my left overhead to my right overhead will probably be 2.60 meters, about maybe 250 in the end, but something in that range will get you into a good overhead position. So that's really handy if you don't have the DART, if you don't want to make a drawing and calculate, that will give you a very quick assumption. Okay. So this is what we explain in that chapter number 4. So congratulations, this was probably the most complicated chapter. And so it's absolutely fine if you take a little bit more time and go through that and play with DART a little bit and see what happens if you change a value and ask yourself, why is that happening now? But I think after some time you will get a good understanding, and then it's a very handy, nice tool. Oh, I forgot one thing earlier. So if you want to use 9 speakers, then you just click here and you change your layout to be, for example, 914. So this would add the wide speakers. Just a little thing here. Okay. Let's go back to the document. And now, as I said, the main chunk of the room design is done. You have your mix position, you have your surrounds, you have your overheads, all the speakers are in place. And now you can start thinking about the subwoofer. So there are 2 things regarding bass. One is the so-called LFE channel, the low frequency effects. That is the 0.1. You remember 5.1? That's 5 speakers and 1 subwoofer or LFE channel. And the same as in Atmos. When you say 7.1.4, the 0.1 is the LFE channel. So it's a dedicated channel in every Dolby Atmos mix. And you can do things like you can put explosions and rumble there if you do a film mix, or you can do the kick drum or elements of your musical mix to that channel. And obviously, you need a speaker to reproduce that channel, and that's the LFE speaker. And that's, of course, a subwoofer that you put somewhere in your room. Okay, that's one thing. And then there's a completely different concept that is called bass management. And bass management is not a channel. Bass management is something that you can do in your monitor chain. You can redirect the low frequencies from some speakers to the subwoofer. So you would basically put a little crossover and you say everything below 70 Hertz goes not to my surrounds or tops, but it goes straight to the subwoofer. The reason why you want to do that is because if your surrounds or your top speakers, for example, are not full range, so they don't go down to 40 Hertz or lower, but you still want to hear those low frequencies, so then you route those low frequencies to the subwoofer. And that's what we call bass management. So bass management happens in your room when you monitor. So it's not part of your mix, it's just part of your monitor chain. And many modern speaker controllers can do that. We speak about that in chapter number 7 when we go back to talk about that. It's just something to consider. It's not mandatory. There can be Dolby Atmos rooms where all the speakers are full range, so every speaker can go down to 40 Hertz by itself. In that case, you don't need any bass management. But in many cases, especially the overhead speakers, are typically slightly smaller in size. So that's why you might want to have bass management for those. Okay. Now the next question is, how many subwoofers do you need? Again, there is actually no hard and fast rule, so it depends on your budget, it depends on the capabilities of your speakers, and it depends on your room. So there are many Dolby Atmos studios that have one subwoofer, slightly bigger one, that is handling both the LFE channel and the bass management. And there are cases where people have not one, but two slightly smaller ones, for example. And there are even cases where people have one subwoofer that is only handling the LFE channel and additional subwoofers that handle only the bass management. So you split these two tasks into two different physical speakers, and that's also possible. So basically, if you're unsure about this, then that's the point where you actually need to start doing some testing. Take a subwoofer, put it in your room, see where it performs best. If you have a difficult room in terms of bass behavior, if you have a lot of room modes, standing waves, it can actually help to have multiple subwoofers. So not one big one, but for example, two smaller ones, because this can help to cancel out the room modes a bit better. And the same, I would say, if you have the budget to use dedicated bass management subs, that's great. Do that. But it's not strictly mandatory. That's basically what we say in chapter 5. In terms of placement, there is no hard and fast rule. It really depends on your room. The DART will automatically consider the LFE to be here, halfway between left and center, or halfway between right and center. That's typically a good starting point. Slightly off axis usually helps with the room modes. If you have multiple ones, you could have, for example, one here and one here, or you could have both right next to each other. If you use dedicated subwoofers for bass management, you can do that with this little checkbox here called BM sub, bass management sub. And in that case, you typically have two, one to bass manage the left side of the room and the other one to bass manage the right side of the room. And you see DART will automatically put them here, like in that area of the speakers that you're managing. But that's of course not necessary. You can also place them somewhere else, like right up to the front or right up to the rear. So we really want you to put the subwoofers where they perform best in the room. because we think that the subwoofers are not really that easy to localize anyways. So it's not that you can easily pinpoint the direction of the subwoofer. So that also gives you some liberty in terms of placement. Okay, very simple. And then we come to the chapter number 6. Choose loudspeaker models. There's one concept in Dolby Atmos that we call the monitoring level. And that monitor level is referencing to our Dolby Atmos pink noise. It's a -20 dB pink noise. And when we calibrate speakers, we typically use that as a reference signal. So it's -20 RMS. It's the same also used by all the certified service partners because they have been trained by Dolby, so they tune rooms the same way as we do. So we all use this -20 RMS pink noise. And for example, we go into a room and we tune all the speakers that this pink noise is 79 dBc at mix position. Now, if you start playing full-scale signals, very loud signals, electric guitars, explosions, these kind of full-scale signals, that can, of course, be up to 20 dB louder than our monitor calibration signal. That means your speakers need to be able to play back not 79, but actually 99, 20 dB more. And they have to be able to do that at mix position. So that means if you're, for example, 2 meters away from the speaker, that means the speaker needs to be a little bit louder because it has to be so loud that it's still 99 at your mix position in full scale moments. And that's not easy to calculate. That's why DARDT is helping you. You just click here, you go into this drop-down menu, you pick a speaker, and DARDT will tell you if the speaker is powerful enough for your chosen monitor level. So, for example, if you would choose a Genelec 8020, DARDT will tell you, oh, that's not big enough for such a big room. I mean, you have a room that's 5 by 4 meters, 20 square meters, and you want to use very tiny 8020s as your main monitors. That's not a good idea, and that's why DARDT is red. And if you say no, okay, I use 8350s, that will get green. Let's say, yeah, that's a powerful speaker for this size of room. And the monitor level, it defaults to 79, but in a big room you can also increase it. So 85 is the calibration level we use in premium studios and in cinema stages. So if you go to 85, you see basically the headroom colors change. So DARDT is now saying, oh, 85, that's already yellow. But if you monitor 82, then these speakers will be fine. So again, you can pick your monitor level. You can basically ask yourself, is it more of a average size room, or am I shooting for a premium music or film mixing stage? Then you go maybe to the 85. All right. And then, of course, you can use different models. So you can, for example, use bigger models for the front and slightly smaller models for the surrounds. And as you can see in this drop-down menu, we allow any speaker type. So we have a lot of models in this drop-down menu. So to make it fair, I just choose a different manufacturer now for my surrounds. Typically, we always want you to have the same brand of speakers on all speakers. So for example, you have big Genelecs in the front and small Genelecs in the rear, or big Neumanns in the front and small Neumanns in the rear. So you can mix and match between, but you should stay in the same brand family because that makes the room calibration easier. But it's not a hard and fast rule. So that would also allow you to mix brands, okay, as you can see here. All right, so you pick your speakers and you have a look at the headroom. Just go back to, say, to this one. And there is one additional important thing. For every speaker, we have two values. One of them is the speaker by itself, and the second value is called 80 Hertz BM. BM stands again for bass management. So that means if you base manage that speaker, we assume that this will increase the headroom, because usually the bass is the most critical thing in terms of headroom. So when you base manage a speaker, that means the speaker has more headroom for the other frequencies. So picking the BM model will increase the headroom by like 5 dB or 4 or 5 dB. We get these values from the manufacturers. We don't measure them ourselves, but all the manufacturers are very happy to provide us with values for this tool. Okay, now it's the time to look at the advanced features, because maybe the most important thing, if you switch to advanced, it will add additional checkboxes down here. That's the only difference that changes between the advanced mode and the basic mode. And I think if you go to the music advanced, it will auto set your monitoring level to 85, because for the premium music studios, we recommend 85. But besides, it's really these extra checkboxes. And I think the most important one for you might be the extra equipment entry. If you want to work with a speaker that's not in this database, I mean, this database, as you can see, is already very long. Yeah, but if you want to work with a model that's not in here, you can enable the extra equipment entry, and a new tab appears. You can click here and you can enter additional speakers. So you can enter your dream speaker custom, and you will have to enter the max SPL, because we need to know that, of course, to calculate that speaker. And now the speaker will pop up here. And be careful, the new speaker will always be at the bottom of the list. So if you're looking for it, it will always be at the bottom. Okay, now you have the dream speaker as your surrounds. Okay, and one more thing that might happen if you pick your speakers, you might want to work with passive speakers. In that case, you untick that little checkbox here, and that will open an additional field where you need to specify your amplifier, because obviously if you have a passive speaker, then you also need an external amplifier, so you can specify the amplifier, and the whole drop-down menu changes, and now it contains passive speakers. So we go and we select a passive speaker, and then we select a amplifier to match that. So now DARDT is calculating both the speaker and the amplifier. But I mean, in the majority of home entertainment and music studios, we work with active speakers. So once you click the checkbox back in, the drop-down fields will reappear, and you can select your active speaker. And now, to be fair to everybody, this time I will pick PMCs. Let's do PMCs. Okay. All right. Yeah, one more thing to mention here when picking speakers. If you pick a subwoofer, you can choose to have one subwoofer, or you can have multiple ones. So you can just click on this drop down and say, I have multiple subwoofers. And then you can have an additional checkbox to say if these subwoofers are clustered right next to each other or not. So if they are clustered, this increases the headroom, because when the speakers stand right next to each other, that usually benefits in terms of headroom. Okay. So now we have chosen our speaker models. And now it's time to look at the last chapter. Choose audio interfaces and have a look at what else you need in your room. We call that speaker management requirements, okay? So typically in every Dolby Atmos room, you need an audio interface that has enough outputs for your speakers. Oh, big surprise. But yeah, it means if you have 714, for example, you will need 12 physical outputs plus most likely a headphone output. So please consider that when you make your budget, remember these things. And then you need something to control your monitoring, to turn all the levels of all your speakers up and down, to do dim and mute and solo. That's very, very easy in stereo, but it's actually not that easy to do that for 12 or more speakers. The market has really reacted to Dolby Atmos, so we have a lot of options now in the market. But of course, still, it's something to think about, and it might add some dollars or euros to your budget. And the last thing is you need to consider to EQ your speakers, to calibrate your speakers, because in Dolby Atmos, some speakers will be in the corner of the room, some will be below the ceiling, hanging from the ceiling. So you might need to tune those speakers to compensate, for example, for the fact that they are in the corner of your room, your back surrounds. So that's why we need room EQ. And probably not all the speakers will have the exact same distance to you. So that's why you need delay. And we already spoke about bass management. So all of these things need to happen somewhere. So you also need to think about where do you do that. There are dedicated devices to do that. Sometimes you can even do it inside the speaker. But very often you have now devices where all of this is in one interface. So you have your audio interface that includes a monitor controller, and that includes EQ, delay, and bass management. When you're unsure, you can just, you find a lot of resources online. You can ask the question in our forum. We are very happy to answer. And of course, you can reach out to the Dolby certified service partners. They sell these kind of equipments on a day-to-day basis, so they can also give you some feedback. Okay, so here we will give you QR codes of the most important websites that I showed in the webinars. So you can simply scan the QR code with your phone to get to that website. So here is the first one. This is the landing page of our Dolby Atmos music and post knowledge base. And here is the second link. This is the direct link to the room design forum. So when you start designing your room and you have any questions, simply post them in that forum, and several people at Dolby are reading actively in that forum and will be able to answer your questions. And of course, also other users will be able to give their feedback. Last but not least, this is the room design section of the knowledge base. This is the page I showed earlier in the webinar, and here you will find the Dolby Atmos Studio Technical Guidelines and the DARDT Dolby Atmos Room Design Tool. Okay, so we have a little look at the possible routing options, how that actually looks. So the most common option is that you install the Dolby renderer on the same machine as your audio workstation. So we call that in-the-box workflow. So you have your computer, you have your audio workstation running, and you have your Dolby Atmos renderer running. And these two are connected through something that's called a Dolby Audio Bridge. But that's not that important in this moment. We have tutorials for that in our professionalsupport.dolby.com. What's important for us now is what comes behind that computer. So that's, of course, an audio interface and room EQ, delay, bass management, monitoring. And then you connect your speakers to that. And of course, you connect your headphones. So you can see this is the backend that you always need. And as I mentioned, this can be one device or it can be split into multiple devices. Depends on what you want to use. So there's an alternative workflow where you install the Dolby Atmos renderer on an external machine. So in that case, you have your workstation running, and then you connect to a second machine, to a physical second machine that is running the Dolby Atmos renderer. In that case, you need 128 channels to go from one to the other. And then to that second machine, you connect your 12-channel interface, monitoring, and headphones. So slightly different because basically there's a second machine in the way. But you see in terms of these requirements, it's the same. And nowadays, more and more common, of course, is the third option, where you have a native renderer. So you use an audio workstation where like Logic, Cubase, Nuendo, Pro Tools, Presonus Studio One, where the Dolby Atmos renderer is already built in. In that case, you connect your audio interface straight to the audio workstation. You don't need the renderer in between. But even in that case, you see this is still the same. So you always need some kind of interface to do room EQ, delay, bass management, monitoring. That's the magic combination that you always need to do. And that actually closes chapter number 7, and that's the end of our document. So this should hopefully give you a good idea how to design your Dolby Atmos room. And we will do a second video right after where we take all of that and we use it in a real world example. So I will show you an actual studio that we worked on, and I will show you how the room plan looks for that room and how the DART is used in that room.